This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. This week, our podcast is brought to you by the Australian Government. From the 1st of July this year, every Australian taxpayer will receive a tax cut. You can use the tax cut calculator at taxcuts.gov.au to estimate your annual tax cut and see what it means for you. Annabelle Hickson is the founder and editor-in-chief of Galah magazine, an independent print magazine that documents regional Australia and the people who live there. It's beautiful and well loved by tens of thousands of Australians. At the heart of it, it's truly an ode to rural and regional Australia. And she runs it from her pecan farm outside of Tenterfield in regional New South Wales. The reason I wanted to talk to her on News Club is because in recent months, there's been a number of big legacy brands that have re-entered the print market. We're talking Elle, Cosmopolitan, even CommBank has recently launched a magazine. So I talked to Annabelle about the possibility that she's ahead of the curve and why the physical print product is so important in our very digital world. Then there's the other news angle. Annabelle is a city girl turned country and has committed her life to the bush. So we talk about local news or the lack thereof, perceptions of rural life, of the people, and specifically of why they vote the way they do, especially in relation to last year's referendum. I've done an Annabelle-themed deep dive these past few weeks, you'll be pleased to know. One of the things I've heard you say over and over and over again, it's easy to have an idea, doing it is the hard part. That's in relation to when people ask you about Galah and how you started Galah and how you got going and the whole thing. But because I know a lot more about you than I did a couple of weeks ago now, I think the pecan farm might actually be where we begin, because that might be the start of this entrepreneurial journey. Can you tell us a little bit about that decision?
Absolutely. So the pecan farm, I live there, and I'd like to say I'm a pecan farmer, but truthfully, my husband is the pecan farmer. I'm just his sort of very happy flatmate there. So I don't have much to do with the actual business, but it's been so formative for me because it's like, to me, Ed and that business is like the ultimate entrepreneurial journey. So we were living a few hours west in Moree. Ed he's been a farmer all his life.
Cotton farmer?
He grew up on a sheep farm and then, in his young adulthood, crops, cotton. He still grows cotton downstream from where we are now. And there was pecans. They're not a very big industry in Australia.
This is what I'm curious about.
Yeah. So near Moree is Australia's biggest pecan farm. It was started in the 60s by an American guy who came over and literally started the pecan industry. So when we were living in Moree, Ed, we'd often drive past it and you could just see Ed like staring out the window looking at these trees because all the crops that he grows, every year you replant them. So it's not a permanent crop at all. You can shift depending on prices, chop and change, grow wheat, grow sorghum. Pecans are super different. It's a permanent thing. You're in it for the long haul. I sometimes wonder if it's sort of maybe like being a journalist writing daily news and then shifting to being a novelist. It's like
writing
lots
a book.
Of similar things, similar skills, but like a sort of completely different project. So he owned a farm a couple of hours east. It was just a grazing block, a pretty small grazing block, but it was on the same river system as where he grows cotton. So with the water licenses and where we farm, if you don't have water, you really can't grow anything. So water licenses are everything.
A really big deal.
They're a really big deal. That's where all the value is really. It's much more valuable than the land. So he had a water license that he was using downstream at his cotton farm. But seeing this pecan farm in Moree, I think he just planted the seed in his head, maybe I could do something like that on this grazing block. So over time, tested the soil, it was going to suit pecans perfectly. And because pecans are way more intensive than grazing, you don't need squillions of hectares to make it work. So he started literally planting pecan nuts into the soil, and it was the beginning of a pecan farm. And now we're about 15 years in. It's watching him do that and working out how to work it out. That Kurt Vonnegut quote of you like leap boldly off a cliff and you grow wings on the way down. That's what he did. He sort of just worked it out. And I think just by being near that, by osmosis, it's made me be much more entrepreneurial than I otherwise would have been.
Because I've heard you talk about the fact that you're not the risk taker, which is curious to me because it seems what you've done is quite a risk with Galah. It seems that it is really entrepreneurial. It's really bold, and it's a bold decision. So I like hearing you talk about the fact that, I'm not the risk taker. I'm not the one in the relationship doing these crazy things. But really, have you reflected on that and come to the observation that you are?
Well, it's all relative, isn't it? Like, I'm not particularly clean, but compared to Ed, I'm the clean one in our relationship.
It's so true.
And so he's the entrepreneur, and I think he's it's definitely rubbed off a bit.
Yeah.
But I'm not very good with risk.
Well, let's talk about Galah then, because it's a magazine. I've introed it and I've explained what it is, and we've talked about it a lot in the Squiz. So I feel like hopefully our audience are familiar with Galah as a product. It felt natural, you've said, to lean into a print product, which seems counterintuitive given we live in such a digital world. So just explain that.
Yeah, I know, it sounds bonkers. So I started it 3 years ago, so 2020, 2021. And to start a print magazine then, I mean, what a bonkers, silly idea. But it actually felt like the easiest way to go. So I looked around me, I looked at all the digital media companies and all the digital media that I liked to read and that I would go back to again and again that seemed like it could actually have a business case. Mm-hmm. I looked and I thought, my God, how many people are involved in this, in feeding the digital beast? You know, like 10s, 20, 30 journos, not even counting all the other people that you have to have in a business. And I thought, there's no way I can do that. You know, that I cannot commit to that sort of that pace and those resources, and you know, and I simply didn't have the money for that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I wasn't going to go around and try and raise VC money, you know, for just an idea.
Yeah.
I wanted to give it a go. So I had published a book before with a book publisher, and I had seen that, you know, there are amazing editors, amazing designers, guns for hire. You know, you can hire people who have lots of knowledge and things that you don't have. And I thought that a print magazine, I could, worst case scenario, I can't get anyone to work for me, I can't get anyone involved, I can do this myself. You know, I could hold it in my hand and in my head. And I really wanted to sort of go beyond just the idea and actually sort of build a proof of concept. Like, here is this idea, now how are we going to make it work? So a mag was actually like, felt way easier than investing squillions in a digital website, hiring journos, going for it without being able to test the business case first.
When you put it like that, it makes sense. I mean, as someone who's doing a digital media business, it's kind of frightening that we didn't think that through in the same way. But we'll talk about the viability of print, I guess. But what you're saying to me, and what we talk about a lot, you and I, is this idea of this physical moment that you have with something, like the actual, like, sort of the tangible that you can touch, that you can feel, that you can sit down with. I guess that's a big part of Galah and the Galah experience.
Yeah. Well, because Galah is not a 24-hour news-based thing. You know, our stories are kind of like the more human stories. They're sort of more timeless. You know, you could sit down, you could read any of the stories we published in our first issue. You could read them now and they, you know what I mean? It wouldn't feel like it's old news.
I've heard it described more like a book.
It's a magazine that feels like a book. I mean, nothing's timeless, but the types of stories we choose aren't based on the weekly news cycle, you know? So it's you're not reading Galah just to get information. I think you're reading Galah for pleasure, like how I read novels. You know, it's a different experience. Like, most of my life is spent in the digital world. I'm scanning for information, I'm researching, I'm toggling between Gmail, Instagram, DMs, WhatsApp, you know, the whole shebang, which is great. And having access to that digitally is incredibly democratic in terms of I can live where I do in the middle of nowhere, and I have as much access to these things as you do at your Sydney Squiz office, you know, so that's cool. But I think a lot of people, are digitally overwhelmed.
Absolutely.
Oh my God, my head just can't cope with all, you know, it needs a break. So when I read for pleasure, I really love reading print.
I mean, how many people have you got subscribed to Galah now, to the magazine?
Yeah, so we print 14,000 and subscribers, I think we have about 4,000 subscribers.
Yeah, okay. Yep. Like, that is people paying for this product, which is incredibly difficult to do. And as someone watching you do this is not an easy thing to do. So you're not the only one that's launching a magazine. You did it 3 years ago, as you said. But since then, there has been this resurgence of brands relaunching their magazines. So we look at the likes of Cosmo is coming back in print. Elle's back in print. A couple of brands out of the US are doing print. They're all doing it in the same way that you are, which is not every month. It's not every week. It's not the new idea style of things. Yeah. It's biannual, triannual in your case. Do you think you're onto something?
Well, I do, but I hope. And it's funny. I mean, I also how lucky, because it wasn't a strategy from the beginning.
No, I guess that's my question. Did you sort of foresee this, or is this a lucky ride?
It was a decision because that's what I thought I could do. And as it turns out, it's like, oh, fantastic, I'm not alone. But it's interesting what print's coming back into vogue.
Yeah.
You don't hear of regional newspapers reopening into print. That kind of print's not back into vogue. So I think it is this print that's lush and luxury and pleasurable. That's the print that I think we as a society are still yearning for.
Yeah, I agree. I love receiving Galah, and I've raved about it in that vein, I guess. Let's talk about the business a little bit. We're going to talk about local news a bit later because I think a lot of people will be interested in your perspective on that. But you're a business owner, you're an editor, you're creative, but you are a business owner, and you've spoken really candidly about the challenges of that. So I heard you on a podcast just recently, the Company podcast, talking about it's $160,000 per run to print your magazine. Mm-hmm. You can do the sums in your head on what then you need to bring in. You've talked to me quite a bit about commercial partnerships and advertisers and the challenges around getting people to invest in that way. I want to know why you're being so candid.
Yeah.
A lot of businesses aren't.
I know, and I find it almost comical. It's like, I mean, especially the magazine industry. I think it back in the day, it was fiercely competitive. And people would get scooped and, it was all very hush-hush. You can't reveal the cover until those days are over, And I think that, I mean, I don't have shareholders. I own this business. So I don't have to, I don't have anyone saying, well, that was a bit much.
You don't have to hide.
I don't have to hide. And also I think it's actually just something I enjoy because the more candid I am, the more I hear back from other business owners. This is the first business that I've run. Up until now, I've been an employee. I've been a freelancer. I had no idea how hard small business is. I just had no idea. So I have an infinite amount of questions and also respect for people who are doing it, not just in media. I find that there's a lot to talk about with anyone who's running their own business.
Outside of media.
So I love that. But what also and this again, like choosing to do print and it being, a happy sort of lucky accident, I think choosing to be open and candid has also had this sort of unexpected benefit because big companies like, Fairfax, News Corp, they can't be open and candid because it's a whole business. They can't talk about their personal experiences.
They can move markets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas I can, and I think Galah's not trying to compete with offering the biggest, most value-added news bundle. I'm not in that game. What I'm trying to do, I think, is offer something of value to our readers in a much smaller, more personal way. And I think by being really candid about problems and business stuff, it builds that personal connection, and readers want Galah. They're invested in this sort of personal journey. They want it to keep going, and I think by being so candid, it builds that relationship, and I think it'd make them harder to press unsubscribe.
Yeah, they really know what you're going through.
Yeah.
And if you are signed up to your newsletters, again, you are this isn't just in interviews that you're candid. You're candid all the time about your thoughts and your feelings and how the business is going and how it's traveling.
Yeah.
Let's talk about you as an editor though.
Yeah.
For those who haven't read Galah, what is your and even for those who have, like, how do you choose what goes in? Because one of the things you've talked about is you get a lot of people saying, publish me. Like, publish my writing, publish my stuff. How do you choose?
Yeah, well, this is from being so open and so available to readers. The Anna Wintour Ice Queens who you could not contact if you tried to. I am
you are the antithesis
the opposite of that, and so anyone can email me. So I get loads of pictures from people who are writers, people who aren't writers, and I mean that's amazing. And we've had some amazing stories come in through that way. So I really do want to keep those channels open. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting the kind of type of pictures that come in, and I reckon I get 3 types. One is someone trying to sell something and they want to try and get a story in but really advertising for whatever it is they're trying to sell. Then the second is someone who has an agenda, wants to get something across. And then the third is, oh, hey, there's this really interesting story happening in Jugeong with this group of people, and I just think you might be interested in. They're the pictures.
Yeah.
That's what I want to hear. And to me, it doesn't matter so much if the person pitching is a good writer, because I think good writing can be taught. And what cannot be taught is the noticing the details, noticing these like human, I'm always interested in like creative ways people work within limitations, like sort of human creativity across the whole spectrum, like arty stuff, but as, business stuff as well. And I think that, especially with AI now, like now already, not even in the future now, AI is an amazing editor. Like I've been experimenting with Claude, ChatGPT 4. It's incredible what it can do. But what it cannot do is come up with this is what I saw, this is what I saw on the ground. It can't report.
This is a story.
Yeah. So I think the reporting, on the ground reporting is so precious. And I think that's what's going to hold value over the years to come.
We've seen a decline in local news outlets. Just recently I read in one of your newsletters that The Truth, the Broken Hills newspaper, has closed down.
Yeah.
Talk to me about local news. And as you said, you can access the same news that I can. But who's creating that news and where is that coming from? And is that maybe a path for Galah to fill? Are you experimenting with that a little bit?
Yeah, local news, I just think this is a really important thing. Like right now, I think if you were going to be a slightly corrupt councillor or a slightly dodgy cop in a small town, now's the time to do it, because there aren't people on the ground watching. There just aren't. And I really view local news as a public good. I think it's like having a hospital in the small town where I live. It's like having a school. I think we need good local news, but the business case for local news has never been worse.
I'm interested in your comparison to hospitals and schools. I mean, they're government funded.
Yeah. And we do have, this is the thing. So I actually think it's sort of twofold. I mean, first I want to say we do have publicly funded local news in the form of the ABC. I mean, the ABC has something like 56 bureaus around Australia.
Yeah.
So I think the approach, if we value local news, and maybe some of us don't, but let's assume that we do. Let's assume that good local news is good for everyone. I think we've got two ways that we need to approach it. And the first one is our individual action. You can complain about the lack of local news and it's so dire, but if you don't subscribe to a local news company, how do you expect there to be local news? Like we're so used to not paying for our news.
We used to.
And
now we don't anymore. Yeah.
And now that we've lost local news, which used to be subsidised by classified ads in the paper, used to be subsidised by all these other things that have fallen away. So now we're left with this business case of okay, if we want this, who's going to pay for it? I would argue that we should pay for it. Or we have to convince our government to use our taxpayer funds to subsidise media. It's like, who's covering the local news? And I really do think it's going to have to come down to a public service if we want it to exist. I'm not interested in Galah and looking down this track because I can't see how to make it work as a business. But I believe it's important.
And I think it brings me neatly to perceptions of the bush and of rural Australia and of regional Australia. You spoke to me about the fact that you live in one of the most conservative seats in the country. We were talking about the Voice and the referendum and the results. You spoke about the fact that at your polling booth, I think there were 5 yes votes and the rest were no votes. But the perception people, particularly in the city, might have of people who voted no is quite different to what your experience of those people are.
Yeah, that was a really interesting time. So I grew up in Sydney. I went to uni at Sydney Uni. So the Newtown electorate during the referendum, they had one of the highest yes votes in the country. Out where I live now, like you said, my polling booth, of the 50 people who voted there, 5 voted yes, 3 of them came from my household. So I know everyone who voted no.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I know these no voters. Down the road at another little polling booth, it had the highest recorded no vote in the whole of New South Wales. 96% of people voted no. So, I mean, before the vote, I guess I suspected I lived in no country. I didn't quite realise how extreme it was. And, sort of both ends of the spectrum, looking at my Sydney life and looking at my country life, and I felt really connected to both. And I could feel people, like all my sort of Instagram community or my Sydney friends, I could feel them saying, why did you all vote no? Like, what is going on out there? And then I would look at my friends, my dear friends, my fellow community members who voted no, and I didn't see villains. I didn't see farmers with pitchforks and missing teeth. I saw, there was a bit of the, if we vote yes, we might lose our access to our favourite fishing spot, some crazy stuff. But that was small. The majority of no voters that I saw were people who were more along the lines of, I feel awful voting no, but I don't think more bureaucracy is good for anyone. I largely saw conservative-leaning, community-minded people who had little faith in bureaucracy. That was the sentiment. So I didn't see these hugely, wildly racist people that my friends and community in Sydney pictured.
Like your social media feed.
Yeah. No one on my Instagram voted no.
Yeah.
And it was really, I think what I just want to try and say is perhaps we're not as far away as the numbers on the paper suggest. And I think it's really important, instead of starting any conversation with you idiot or you elitist or whichever way you're coming from.
Or you are that person.
It's we need the centre to hold. And from what I see, with a foot in both camp, we're not as far away as it might look. It's, and this is where you need good stories. You need to have things that actually go beyond the stereotypes. But more than that, people need to have connections directly with each other.
Is Galah trying to do that?
Yeah. Galah is trying to do that.
What's next for Galah then? Because you are, as we started with the fact that you're an ideas person and actually having an idea and then doing the idea. And I've heard you talk about the fact that you have a million ideas every single day. I think you've told me 3 ideas since you walked in the door this morning. And I love that because I can be like that. And I think it's an amazing trait, but the actual doing, and how do you, tell us what's next for Galah and how you're strategic about that and how you've learnt to be strategic about that.
Well, I've learned to be more restrained. Ideas.
No, don't box it up.
Well, no, you have to, because there's no point in having amazing ideas if you can't actually do them.
Yeah.
That's the actual doing of them is what, and to do something well, there's only, limited time and limited man hours. So I have promised my team that this year I'm not going to introduce anything new. I've already broken that promise because
okay, one thing. You can have one thing.
Yeah. I know, maybe just one new thing a year. Maybe that's anyway, we're going to start a podcast. I love podcasts.
Great.
I listen to I reckon at least 2 podcasts a day.
Yeah.
All the drive takes me an hour to drive to the supermarket. Podcasts have changed those hours spent behind the wheel. I love it. Galah's going to start a podcast.
There we go. We'll wait for that one. Annabelle, thank you so much for doing this with me today. I really do love Galah, and for anyone out there who would like to give it a go, head to your website, galahpress.com. For $90 a year, you get 3 editions of Galah, a whole heap of newsletters from yourself and a bunch of other stuff. You also have just produced a Galah book, which is an amazing gift if you're looking to gift someone something really, really beautiful.
Thank you, Kate.
And thank you to anyone who has listened to this episode of News Club. We'll be back on Saturday with the weekly wrap.